Eastern Canada is still holding firmly onto winter right now, and if you step outside across southern Ontario or southern Quebec, it immediately feels like the season has barely shifted at all, despite the calendar saying otherwise. Cities like Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal are sitting under partly to mostly cloudy skies, but the real headline is the temperature and how it interacts with the wind. We are seeing readings around -8 degrees in Toronto, closer to -12 in Ottawa, and near -10 in Montreal, and once you factor in even a modest breeze, it ends up feeling significantly colder on exposed skin. This is not just a passing cold morning either. The broader atmospheric setup is allowing this cold air mass to remain in place longer than you would typically expect in late March. High pressure nearby is helping to keep things relatively dry and stable, which explains the lack of major snowfall or precipitation today. But at the same time, it is also trapping that colder air near the surface. So what you get is this deceptively calm but persistently cold pattern, where skies may not look threatening, yet the air itself tells a very different story. It is one of those classic late-season setups where winter does not leave dramatically, but instead lingers quietly, stretching its influence deeper into spring than many people would prefer. As we expand the view westward into the Prairie provinces, the weather becomes more active, but also more complex in terms of what is driving it. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are currently dealing with light snow and areas of drifting snow, and temperatures here are generally sitting between -5 and -10 degrees. On paper, that might not sound particularly intense, but when you consider the open terrain across much of the prairies, even light snowfall combined with wind can quickly reduce visibility and create localized travel concerns. What is happening here is a subtle but important interaction between lingering cold air at the surface and slightly more moist air moving in above it. That combination allows for these persistent light snow events rather than one large, organized storm system. In other words, it is not a major headline storm, but it is still enough to maintain winter-like conditions across the region. The drifting snow component is especially important because it shows that wind is playing a role, redistributing snow across roads and fields, which can make conditions look worse than the actual snowfall totals might suggest. But then you move further west into Alberta, and this is where the pattern really starts to shift in a noticeable way. Temperatures in cities like Calgary and Edmonton are climbing well above freezing, reaching into the low teens, roughly 11 to 14 degrees, and that represents a significant departure from what we are seeing just to the east. This sharp contrast is not random. It is being driven by a ridge of warmer air pushing into Alberta, likely associated with a change in the upper-level flow that is allowing milder Pacific-influenced air to move inland. When you have that kind of setup, it creates a dividing line across the prairies, where one side remains locked in colder, more unsettled conditions, while the other begins to transition towards something that feels much more like spring. Alberta is essentially sitting on the warmer side of that boundary today, and that is why conditions there feel relatively mild and more comfortable. This kind of temperature gradient can be quite striking during transitional seasons, and it often highlights just how dynamic the atmosphere can be across a country as large as Canada. One province can be dealing with drifting snow, while another is enjoying double-digit temperatures under relatively calm conditions. Moving further west to the Pacific coast, British Columbia is experiencing a pattern that is much more typical for this time of year, especially along coastal areas like Vancouver and the surrounding regions. Skies are mostly cloudy, and temperatures are hovering around 10 to 11 degrees, which places the region firmly in that early spring category. There is no major storm system dominating the area right now, and the influence of the Pacific Ocean is playing a key role in moderating temperatures. Even when clouds are present, the air mass itself is not particularly cold, and that is why it feels noticeably milder compared to the rest of the country. This is a classic example of a marine climate at work, where large bodies of water help to regulate temperature extremes. While inland regions can swing dramatically between cold and warm air masses, coastal British Columbia tends to remain more stable, and that stability is clearly showing up in today's conditions. It is also worth noting that while conditions are calm now, this region is often the entry point for future weather systems that can later impact the rest of the country. So what happens here can sometimes be a preview of what is to come further east. Now, as we shift our focus to northern Canada, including areas like Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, the story becomes much more straightforward, but also much harsher. Winter is still firmly in control across these regions, with temperatures ranging from -15 down to -21 degrees, and in some areas even colder when wind chill is taken into account. Light snow is still occurring in parts of the north, but the more important factor here is the persistence of deep cold air. Unlike southern regions, where seasonal transitions are more noticeable, the north experiences a much slower shift from winter to spring. The snowpack remains in place, and the sun, while gradually becoming stronger, has not yet had enough time to significantly alter the overall temperature profile. This results in a landscape and atmosphere that still behave very much like midwinter, even as the rest of the country begins to move on. It is a reminder of just how vast and varied Canada's climate can be, with different regions operating on entirely different seasonal timelines. When you step back and look at the national picture as a whole, what stands out most is the contrast and the transitional nature of the current weather pattern. Eastern Canada remains locked in a cold, stable, winter-like setup, with temperatures well below freezing and minimal precipitation. The central prairies are dealing with light snow and wind-driven conditions that continue to reinforce that winter feel. Meanwhile, Alberta is breaking away from that pattern, experiencing significantly milder temperatures that hint at the arrival of spring. British Columbia, particularly along the coast, is already there in many ways, with relatively mild temperatures and stable conditions influenced by the Pacific. And then in the far north, winter continues largely unchanged, with deep cold and persistent snow cover dominating the landscape. From a meteorological perspective, this kind of setup is a textbook example of a seasonal transition phase, where different regions of the country are effectively in different seasons at the same time. The atmosphere does not shift uniformly, especially across a country as geographically diverse as Canada. Instead, you get these sharp gradients and contrasts, where the battle between winter and spring plays out differently depending on location. Cold Arctic air is still lingering and occasionally pushing southward, while milder air masses are beginning to advance from the west. The result is a patchwork of conditions that can vary dramatically over relatively short distances. Looking ahead, this type of pattern often signals that more changes are on the horizon. As we move deeper into spring, the expectation is that the colder air currently dominating eastern Canada will gradually weaken and retreat, allowing temperatures to moderate. However, that process is rarely smooth. Transitional periods like this are often marked by variability, with swings between cold and mild conditions and occasional late-season snow events still very much on the table. The presence of lingering cold air means that any incoming moisture has the potential to produce snow rather than rain, especially in central and eastern regions. So while milder conditions are beginning to show up in places like Alberta and British Columbia, it would be premature to say that winter is completely finished across the country. In terms of overall impact, today's weather across Canada is less about extreme events and more about the broader pattern and what it represents. It is a snapshot of a country in transition, where different regions are experiencing very different realities at the same time. For residents in Ontario and Quebec, it still feels like winter has more to give. For those in the prairies, it is a mix of lingering snow and gradual change. In Alberta, there is a clear sign that spring is starting to take hold, while British Columbia continues to benefit from its typically milder coastal climate. And in the north, the long winter season continues with little sign of immediate change. All of this comes together to form a dynamic and evolving weather story, one that highlights both the scale of Canada's geography and the complexity of its climate. It is not a single narrative, but rather a combination of multiple regional patterns all interacting at once. And that is what makes this particular setup so interesting. It is not just about temperatures or cloud cover in one area, but about how those elements differ across the country and what that tells us about the transition from winter to spring.